All right. Now, many of you are not feeling that engaged by the discussion, which is interesting in itself, considering that you wanted it. Remember when we asked you what do you want to talk about? What do you feel is the reasons for that? What do you feel is the reason why for the lack of engagement to the subject so far?
It could be because a lot of us just like staying in our facade selves, and we don't want to really see how much sexual injuries that we all have, and how much we really dislike being the gender that we are.
Well, that sounded pretty intellectual as an answer. When you say stay in your facade self, what is the emotion? When we talk about sex and sexual matters, what is one of the dominant emotions on the planet with regard to sex and sexual matters? Shame. Okay, so let's just put this up. Shame.
And Jane, you mentioned one of your emotions right there at the end.
Can you remember?
Yeah, how much, I know personally for myself, I don't like being a woman, so that's being my gender. So
and anger about being a woman.
Anger and then, probably shame or fear as well.
Yeah.
With regard to sex, why is it that sex causes so much feelings of shame when sex is just like we all have sexual organs, we all we all have legs and we all have arms and we all have sexual organs as well. So why is it that when we start discussing the sexual organs and our responses, that shame seems to be the dominant emotion? When if we start talking about your legs and your arms, you'd mean, well, why are you even talking about this? This isn't, that'd be relatively unimportant subjects. Why is the sexual subject such a thing?
I feel that it's related to rejection too,
Well, let's look at that. So there's the issues of rejection. Yeah, a rejection of what though? Can we be more specific?
Well, a rejection of myself, or a rejection of a man, and my shame around the rejection that I have of men.
Okay, what about not only of self, but of bodily functions?
Yep.
Right. Anything else that we can think if we can take the mic? We'll work our way across. If we bring the other
Did
mic.
someone else have their hand up after this?
Yeah, whoever else had a hand up.
So you first.
Shall I say it?
Yes.
Yes, far away.
Well, I would have thought that it's because we're brought up to cover everything up, and because especially our sexual organs down here are close to our waste disposal. You know how to put it, I don't know. So we associate it as something dirty, but we're brought up to feel it.
Private.
Yeah, we're told we have to cover even our breasts. We have to cover. Men don't have to cover their breasts, but we do because these are the things that we've got nipples that feed the children, and it's a whole.
Well, isn't the fact that a woman covers her breast primarily because men view them as sexual objects?
Yes.
Isn't that the main cause? Yeah. And the reality is men do view them as sexual objects, so that whereas most women don't view a man's chest as a sexual object necessarily. Some may, but can you see the difference, obviously? And but you're right, there is this thing of feeling dirty with regard to sexual matters.
Which is actually our parents' shame imposed upon us, isn't it?
Yep.
Cover that up.
Yep, anything else? We were over here, yep.
I don't know if this works or not.
No, it is working.
Okay. Lots of heavy guilt from churches.
Guilt?
Tons
Not
of
just
it.
from churches, actually. A lot of
Or judgment against sexuality.
Good judgment, yeah. But a lot of this stuff, like the church, the one thing we must realise is the church is just a reflection of society.
Yeah.
So the reality is that many of the church's impositions upon a particular group of people are actually just the society using religion as a way to project their own feelings towards that group of people. So, for example, if a group of people feel something's dirty, then they'll create a religion that actually teaches that that particular thing is dirty.
Right.
Does that make sense?
And
Yeah,
they'll
that
hold
makes
on
sense.
to that teaching.
And they'll hold on to that
Yeah.
teaching as long as they possibly can.
And then if you feel different, and you just, your instinct feels that this is not okay, or why should it be okay the day after you get married and the day before not? That's what my mom told me. She says, and she grew up in the generation where it was absolutely not okay, except for having children and so on. She said that already didn't make sense to me.
Yep.
And I remember before, when I had my first boyfriend, for a whole year, I had a diary where I just was grappling with the guilt, and because I grew up in the Catholic Church,
Yep.
it was not okay unless you were married and all that. It's
Exactly.
huge.
So belief systems certainly
Yeah.
impose their shame upon you.
Yeah, obviously.
So
yeah.
it's not necessarily that we personally feel shame, but what actually happens is the belief systems impose their shame. So what we're talking about there is really a group of emotions where we are invested in other people's opinion of us.
Yeah, but even if you know deep in your gut it's wrong, then you get into conflict what is imposed on you by your parents or society where you happen to live, and what your own feelings are.
Well, what I'm saying to you, though, in return is that when I'm invested in my parents' viewpoints more than my own,
Yeah,
that then causes me to feel shame about my own.
right.
That's
But
where the conflict comes
That's
from.
where the conflict comes from.
Yeah.
Like, for example, if you came up to me now and said, "Oh, you're a dirty cow because you're sleeping with this man and you're not married,"
Yeah.
I'd go, "Oh, I feel pretty dirty about a lot of other things, but that's not one of them,
Yeah.
because I'm not invested in
Yeah,
what you
okay.
think about
Yeah,
me."
sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
But if you said that Mary was dirty because of some things she did in the first century,
Or even this
she would
life.
say, or even in this life, she would feel quite differently.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
So we take on the opinions of others based on what is already unhealed within ourselves, is the principle there. Yep. But you're right, belief systems certainly have a large effect on our willingness and openness to discuss matters of sexuality.
Yeah,
Yep.
absolutely.
Where
Who's
else?
got the
Pauline, if you go there.
This is very similar, but slightly different. It's the fear of unwanted pregnancy.
Well, would it be more the guilt of unwanted pregnancy or the fear
Well, there's a
of
history of this in my family.
Right, yes.
And, linked to the Catholic Church.
Should we call it unwanted results?
Okay, yeah.
So they might not just be pregnancy?
Might not be pregnancy,
Yes.
could also be
Disease.
venereal diseases and so
Disease,
forth.
yeah.
But let's look at the unwanted pregnancy. Historically, if a young woman was unmarried and got pregnant, she would normally be put in isolation for at least the 9-month period that she was pregnant. She would be ostracised and criticised, and many of them, generationally, were then taken and completely expelled from the family. They weren't even allowed. The father and the mother would treat them as sluts, and that they would never ever see them again. Yes. Now, the threat of that is pretty painful emotionally. So it's no wonder.
Yeah,
I have met a woman in a psychiatric institution who's been in there since the age of 16.
Yeah.
She was around 60 because of pregnancy
Yeah.
at the age of 16.
Yeah, it's sad, eh? Just because of the condemnation of the environment at the time. Yeah, yep. So unwanted results is a big issue. We for some reason, if we have some kind of a skin injury, we go, oh yeah, we just got an injury. But if we have a venereal disease, now that's quite shameful. Can you see there's a big difference between those two things? There is also some soul-based reasons why we also have sensitivity to sexual matters that are actually based on pure emotions. What do you think they may be? Do you understand my question?
Do you understand?
Can I explain my question?
Something with... Yeah.
There are some pure things within the soul regarding sexuality that we've already taught you today that may also be the result of, may also be one of the reasons why we have a tendency towards shame about the issues.
Yeah, I think it's that we know about our soulmate and that there is something wrong having sex the way we do it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So in other words, at some level we know truth, that there is just one connection, one person. And when we look at our sexual past, We haven't had just one person's, most people haven't. And so all of a sudden there's a lot of shame about our past as a result. You see, this is I suppose you could say, what appears to be the negative part of truth is that we often then feel ashamed about our own life and judge our own life in comparison with that truth. And we often do that.
And that's certainly a huge issue for me. And obviously the truth is quite strong in my soul, even though I was in quite heavy denial of it for a long time. So even my sexual responsiveness and my orgasm, I'm working through recently the fact that was very shut down because I had this sense that it should be for my soulmate, and it wasn't. I wasn't engaged with my soulmate, and so I even found it difficult to orgasm and be engaged with other people. Yeah. Yep.
So often we have this feeling of what is right within us, and when we do what is the opposite to the feeling of what is right, there is a saying that our conscience, which is the inbuilt mechanism we have to know what the difference between right and wrong is, our conscience bothers us. And when our conscience bothers us and we don't allow ourselves to feel why it's bothering us, we often feel emotions of shame or guilt rather than feeling the reason why our conscience is bothering us, if that makes sense to you. Yeah. Who else was that?
Nico, did you
Nico
have
was
your
at the
hand
back
up?
there.
Yep.
If we could go at the back. And Di is next then.
I just want to say exactly that most of my time in my life, I used sexuality as a tool to feel like a man, but in my heart, I knew
that something was wrong with this.
Yeah.
Yep.
And because I used it, and then it comes the other fact that I allowed, with the same aspect to be used from other people.
Yes.
And there is where is a lot of guilt and anger towards myself. How could I allow that? Because you know the truth, but you allowed it.
So could
betrayal.
So could I say, as a summary of what you're saying, that we know the truth that bartering sex is damaging?
And we sort of begin to feel that as well, don't we? Like we get into the barter, it feels okay because we got satisfied what we were trying to avoid or what, but after a while it doesn't feel good. Yeah.
Yep. So many of us in sexual relationships have become used to bartering sex it's almost like a commodity that is universal. It's even more universal than the money we have because all of us have different types of dollars and so forth. But sex is a universal commodity. It's a commodity we can use with anybody on the planet pretty much if we wish to in order to get what we want and satisfy what they want.
And for myself, I even was willing to... the barter for me was touch. I wanted to be held and touched. And I was willing to have sex just to have that one thing met.
And we were discussing this a few days ago, myself and Mary, that it's interesting that every time we barter something for another thing, it's often that we don't get the other thing anyway.
Yeah.
So what Mary
who
found
did I attract? Yeah.
Was that in the bartering of the sex for the touch, she finished up not having very satisfying sex, but also having no person hang around and touch her afterwards. Does that make sense? So often that occurs. Joy, down the front there. Di. We were Di next, sorry. So let's go Di first.
A lot of my unloving actions are associated with sex, with men.
Okay.
And if I have a desire to love, I'm very confronted
about the unloving actions. Yeah, that's very good. So again, we know the truth that we are being unloving.
We have been unloving.
Or we have been unloving. Yeah. And that's so. Can you see some of the shame and guilt and everything is all related to emotions that are nothing like there's nothing wrong in reality, but some of the emotions related to our shame and guilt are that we have reasons to be ashamed and guilty about the choices we've made with sexuality. So there is this is the conundrum with sexual desire and sexual attraction, is that some of the emotions that we think are impure are actually pure, And then some of the emotions that we think are pure or we've believed were pure in the past were actually impure, and there's a lot of confusion about which one's pure, which one's not pure. And so therefore there's a lot of confusion about our emotions in dealing with sexual attraction as a result. Yeah? Joy?
Just like what you were saying, I think it's, particularly in the age that I was brought up, lack of information and education, like it wasn't even talked about.
Very true.
There was no communication and there were no words.
But why was there no communication in that generation? There was there's underlying emotional reasons why there's no communication.
Well, because they were ashamed, I guess.
Yes. So the problem is if the adult generation feels shame about sex and sexuality issues, they're imposing those feelings of shame and guilt immediately upon any child that's now conceived. And so by the time the child is born and growing, the child is now also feeling all these issues and shame, and nobody wants to talk about it. The child can't go to the parent and say, "Oh, mummy, you know, I actually had this happen to me the other day to my vagina or my penis and whatever," and mummy just goes into a meltdown because she feels so ashamed about the whole thing. And so what do we learn to do? We learn to not discuss it openly, and we also then, and the problem is information then goes underground. So in other words, a lot of people then start getting information through pornography and other means, rather than it just being openly talked about, and therefore there's very little need to go underground to get information about sex and sexuality. Yeah. Yeah. Any other things you see, Dennis?
Yeah, about 18 months ago, finished a relationship because I just felt I was being used, but even worse, I felt I was using.
Yep.
Yeah, it was just, and when that hit me as an emotion, it was just blew me away.
Yeah, so what you're saying really is the more sensitive you became to love, the less willing you were now, and the more ashamed you felt of your behaviour when you were unloving and just using.
That's it, yeah. It's just tremendous.
Yep.
That's the beautiful thing about developing our soul and opening, isn't it? We begin to become far more sensitive to what's loving and what isn't, and it guides us. Even if we don't know the overarching rules, we feel like, oh, no, I know that's not going to lead to good things. Yeah.
So can you see there's these two sides to the issue. There's the side of the issue which you could say are these sides to the issue, which are all of these...
It's like injuries imposed upon us, isn't it?
Yeah, injuries imposed upon us by our environment that cause us then to feel certain things about sex and sexuality that we feel that we then can't discuss openly and truthfully, the desires and passions and longings that we have within us. And then on this other side, we have a knowing, sort of like an inside understanding or knowing of the truth inside of us, like what we call a soul knowing, if you could call it, a soul instinct about the truth about it. And whenever we conflict or our actions have conflicted with those soul-based instincts of surrounding love, then what finishes up happening is we feel bad about ourselves and therefore feel shame and therefore feel guilt and feel a bad conscience and triggers us and we then feel like we don't want to discuss that. When you think about it, not wanting to discuss that is all really about just not being humble enough to our emotion. Not being humble to admit that, yes, I have bartered sex. Yes, I have been unloving in my sexual interactions. Yes, I might have had some kind of sexual disease as a result of my use of sex, for example. Yes, I have had other things happen. You know, I've had many. Let's say, I've had many, and these. I'm not saying these from my perspective. So a lot of people, when I quote things, they then quote me as saying this has happened to me, and then they get all.
That's the next media. Yes, I have had a venereal disease. Yeah. Yes, I have.
Right, and I haven't. But the reality is that what I'm saying is, even if I have, right, then there's this instinct inside of us knowing, well, something was wrong there, something was up there, and there's an instinct then of feeling, well, something was wrong, but then there's this feeling of condemnation of ourselves, and then also an unwillingness to discuss openly that condemnation of ourselves or that feeling that we had.
Yeah, and in my experience, the way that I have been most manipulated sexually and the way I've actually entered into things that cause me more and more shame is through the avoidance of acknowledging my shame, whether they be sort of shame as a result of my soul instinct or shame as a result of injuries imposed upon me. While I lived in denial of that shame and the truth of what really went on, that is when I became more and more disconnected with sex and love as one entity, as I believe that's the most harmonious way to experience sex. And I also, through the law of attraction, obviously, accumulated more shame because I didn't want to feel these things, so then I would enter into exchanges as a result of denying those emotions. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yep. Okay, so the question then becomes, well, the only way to heal things regarding sexual attraction that are out of harmony with the way God designed them to be is firstly to intellectually even acknowledge that they are out of harmony, which means we have to at some point have a discussion about the issues. Now, if we're already resistive to having a discussion about the issues, how are we ever going to feel the emotion about the issues? Can you see? So while all of these things are true, that there are injuries that we have imposed upon us that cause us to feel shame, and while, yes, that's also true, that we do have a soul instinct to what's loving, and every time we've been unloving, we do feel also some shame or guilt or a bad conscience. At the end of the day, whether we feel a bad conscience or we have injuries imposed, we still need to enter the discussion before anything can be resolved. And we need to enter have an openness to entering the discussion about our emotions, about the particular things that guide our sexual attractions. So this is where many people have a lot of difficulty. For instance, many heterosexual males would have a lot of trouble admitting any single time that they felt an attraction to another male. Can you see that? And many heterosexual females will have usually difficulty doing the same and admitting to an attraction they had with another female. Many of us also would be very resistive to talking about our sexual history. It's interesting, we're totally open about talking about every other piece of history generally that we have.
People come and tell us for hours.
Yeah, what their other histories are. But when it comes to our sexual history, we don't want to examine it. And what I'm suggesting to you, if you want to heal sexual attraction so that sexual attraction comes into line with the way God designed it, and that is, right at the beginning we said that what that was, that is that you will only ever be sexually attracted to your soulmate no matter who else is around. That's the pure way that God designed. Then what we're going to have to do to get to that point is we're going to have to discuss our sexual attraction by looking at our sexual history in terms of what we have done in the past. We're going to need to have an openness emotionally and also even intellectually to feeling about our sexual history before we can discover the real reasons why things happen. Now, what I've found in my own progression and what I've noticed in almost everybody else who's trying to progress is that there is a deep resistance many times to discussing the history about anything in particular, but particularly their sexual history. And this deep resistance then causes us to not be able to heal particular things. And the ironic thing about our sexual history is that most of the time it was not created by any warped sexual desires or passions. The reality is, and this is a basic truth, that our sexual history was created most of the time by our unhealed emotions not related to sex at all, but actually related to other emotions and feelings. So, as Mary's written there, most sexual injury is not related to sex. This is the sad irony of our inability to be open in the discussion. Because the sad irony is we don't want to be truthful and honest about our sexual history because we should feel shame and guilt. Some of the shame is understandable because we did shameful things sometimes, and some of the shame is not understandable in that it was imposed upon us by our environment. But either way, we don't want to discuss it because at the end of the day, we feel there's something inside of us that must be terribly warped. Right? Something inside of me, and it's interesting, many people on the planet feel this anyway, that there's something inside of me that's terribly badly damaged and warped, and there's something wrong with me. There's basically something intrinsically wrong with my nature that caused me to do this shameful thing that I remember in the past. And the reality is that most of the shameful things that we've done in the past, even the shameful things we've done sexually, are not related to sexual things at all. They're actually related to other emotions and the intensity of the other emotions driving this opening of our sexual desires. Remember the discussion we had earlier about the chakras and how they were in codependent sympathy, in terms of a codependent addiction that's in sympathy between the male and female creates an openness of a flow of energy, yes? And then in this process of this flow of emotional energy, we then feel what most of us would term sexual desire or horny. We feel horny or some sign of sexual desire. Now, many times these sexual desires are totally unrelated to things that we think they're related to. That's the sad thing. And our lack of ability to discuss it openly is actually making it more hidden than what it needs to be.
And it takes us further away from uncovering what's driving that injury, what's driving that desire. Yeah.
And so this is where it's very important with sexual attraction and sexual injuries. We need to start being willing to examine them even though we are ashamed, or even though we have been ashamed of our past behaviour. We need to examine them. We need to stop justifying any behaviour that's out of harmony with the pure statement. And when I say we need to, it's up to you whether you do it. But if you want to be at one with God and you want to be at one with your soulmate, at some point there needs to be a recognition of any emotion that prevents those two things from being true. And the sexual history is guided by injuries not related to sex that we need to discuss. Otherwise, if we don't heal them, we'll end up feeling no closer to our soulmate and no closer to God eventually, because eventually we need to heal everything within us, including our sexual injuries, to be closer to God. Right? So, that being the case, what do we need to do? Well, what we need to do is we need to start discussing the link between sexual feelings and emotions that are in addiction with each other. Do you see that? We need to see the relationship between these two things. We need to understand more fully what sexual attraction really is, what actually causes this feeling of sexual attraction.